Yo, Neelia. Bunda pettada. Good morning, everybody. Are you there?
Good morning, madam.
Very good. Anybody else? Shall we start?
Yes, ma'am.
So last class we are discussing about the small intestinal tumors, isn't it? Any doubt regarding last class? Please respond. Hello. So we were discussing about the gastrointestinal or small intestinal tumors last class, isn't it? At least one of you please respond. Fan lane, AC fan is better. So basically, tumors of the small intestine are very, very rare. So they include only 10% about the total tumors of the GIT. So basically divided into benign and malignant tumors. So benign tumors we have discussed, of which PJ syndrome I have discussed in detail, and the importance of PJ syndrome as a forerunner of many malignancies, both GIT as well as non-GIT tumors. So how to follow the patients with the PJ syndrome for the onset of other malignancies. Then malignant tumors we were discussing now. So the most common of which is the adenocarcinoma, then lymphoma. We didn't discuss it in detail because lymphomatous tumors. So we have to discuss it in a separate entity as lymphomas. Then the important one is carcinoid tumor. I was discussing in the last class. So which arises from, it is a neuroendocrine tumor. So more commonly from the appendix, less commonly from the ileum and also rectum. So the most important of which is the liberation of vasoactive amines. So that is the importance of carcinoid tumor, which releases vasoactive amines into the body. So primary tumors are less symptomatic we can say, because the tumor is less and the vasoactive amines that are secreted by the tumor, primary tumor is less. So they are most often carried to the liver, which they are filtered very much and only systemic effects are very minimal. Whereas tumors with the secondaries, so this tumor is known to produce secondaries in the liver mainly. So liver secondaries produces the same vasoactive amines that is released into the body. So without filtering effect of the liver, so naturally, so the tumor with secondaries is likely to produce more of the symptoms, that is carcinoid syndrome. And regarding the management, so mainly surgical management. So prior to surgery, you are supposed to know about the extent of the tumor. So for that, we use what is known as octreotide scanning. I told you something about the octreotide. It is a somatostatic analog used to control the symptoms of carcinoid tumors or the carcinoid syndrome. So carcinoid crisis is a condition in which is due to the liberation of these vasoactive amines from the primary or secondary tumors, whatever it may be, during handling in the surgery. So this octreotide is first used prior to surgery to map out the distribution of the tumor. That is one use of the octreotide scanning. And secondly, it can be used also to prevent the side effects or the carcinoid crisis. So these are the two important indications for the octreotide in carcinoid tumors. And finally, I told you the management of the carcinoid tumor that is pertaining to the appendix. So if it is localized to appendix, that is less than 1 centimeter, simple appendicectomy is enough as a treatment. If it is more than 1 centimeter, say about 1 to 2 centimeters, then you have to see which part of the appendix it is arising. If it is in the tip or in the middle of the appendix, then also appendectomy alone is sufficient. If it is extending into the or coming from the base of the appendix or local spread is there into the adjacent structures, then a right hemicolectomy is needed. If the tumor is more than 2 centimeters, then also right hemicolectomy is indicated. We will now go on to the next one, that is gastrointestinal stromal tumors. It is one of the important tumor, though rare. It is a mesenchymal tumor. It is a rare tumor of GIT. Only constitutes 0.2% of all GI tumors, and most commonly arising from the stomach, rarely seen from the intestines. And there is equal distribution of the tumor between males and females with a ratio of 1:1. The maximum age group in which the tumor presents is 50 to 70 years. Coming the genetics of the GIST, so it is the cell of origin is intestinal cell of Cajal, supposed to be a pacemaker cell in the intestine. There is a mutation of the tyrosine kinase and platelet derived growth factor, that is PDGF alpha. So this has been demonstrated in these patients with the GIST. So 95% of the GIST expresses c-KIT, CD117 mutations. These are the oncogenic proteins that have been demonstrated within the patients with the GIST. And familial GIST occurs as autosomal dominant trait. So that usually shows mutation of germline gene KIT bar PDGF. Next, classification of the GIST based on the tumor size and mitotic activity. So it has been divided into 4 categories: very low risk, high risk, and very high risk. Very low risk means 2 centimeter size. Low risk tumors are between 2 to 5 centimeters. High risk group 5 to 10 centimeter size tumors. Very high risk group more than 10 centimeters. These are the clinical features of this GIST. Apart from the lump in the abdomen presentation, so some of the patients may show lethargy, pain in the abdomen, with nausea and melena. Hematemesis are very common with weight loss. And finally, most of them will come to the surgeon only when the lump in the abdomen appears. So this is the Carnage triad, so which includes 3 malignancies. One is extradural paraganglioma. Second one is pulmonary carcinoma. Third is gastric GIST. Combination of all the 3 Carnage triad. And coming to the about the GIST, 50% of the GIST metastasis, liver metastasis presents with the ascites. And remember that GIST always never metastasizes to distal lymph nodes. It is only metastasized to liver. Coming to the investigations, so the investigations that are necessary in case of GIST in scan abdomen, and then 18 FDG scan, that is PET scan. So CT abdomen usually shows ulceration, calcification, along with metastasis, probably in the so most commonly along with metastasis. And PET scan is also another one which is useful to the diagnosis of the GIST. Coming to the management, of course, includes a surgical resection of the tumor, what is needed in most of the cases, but medical management is not possible in these patients. The drug that is used is imatinib mesylate. It is an oral drug, tyrosine kinase inhibitor. It inactivates the kinase gate, prevents the phosphorylation of receptors and proliferation of the tumor. That's how it acts. And duration of the therapy is very prolonged, that is almost reaches up to 1 year. These are the newer drugs for the management or the treatment of the GIST. SU-1148. It inhibits the tyrosine kinase. The principle is same, receptor, and also blocks prostaglandin, that is a PDGF alpha. And other drugs are sunitinib and dasatinib. These are particularly used when there is a refractory response in the response to imatinib. So this is the newer duct that can be used in this case. So that finishes the tumors of the small intestine. We will now go on to the next topic, diverticulum. So by definition, diverticulum are the and they are the common abnormality.
Number 74, turn off your mic. Number 74, turn off your mic.
So diverticulae are the hollow-out pouchings of intestines or GIT. So that they are the common structural abnormalities. They occur from the esophagus to rectal sigma junction, and commonly the rectum is not involved in these patients. That is rarely involved. So that there are two types of diverticulae, that is congenital and acquired. So the basic difference between both is the congenital diverticula contains all the layers of intestine, whereas acquired may be lacking one, that is muscularis propria. First, we will finish up the acquired diverticula. So most commonly, these acquired diverticula of the small intestine arise from the jejunum. They arise from the mesenteric side of the bowel as a result of mucosal herniation at the point of intra-blood vessels to the intestine. So these blood vessels run in the mesentery and then enter into the bowel. So that forms a weak spot through which the mucosal herniation occurs. Later forms the acquired diverticula. The condition is commonly seen in jejunum. There may be single, but often they are multiple. So then, as I told you, they do not contain any muscular layer. They can vary in size and mostly multiple. Coming to the clinical features of the diverticular disease, the diverticula of the small intestine, they present as incidental finding during surgery in most of the conditions, but sometimes due to bacterial stasis, they may produce malabsorptive features, or sometimes the diverticula may get infected from diverticulitis, or one of it may get ruptured, producing acute abdominal emergency. And bleeding is a rare complication. So these are the clinical features. So they may be innocent and incidental finding during surgery, that is one. And sometimes they may get infected, producing diverticulitis, or sometimes because of the bacterial stasis, malabsorption can occur, and rupture may or perforation may occur, producing acute abdominal emergency. Bleeding is a rare complication. Of course, treatment is surgical excision or resection. Coming to the congenital diverticulum, the common of which is the Meckel's diverticulum. The basic description of Meckel's diverticulum: congenital abnormality of small intestine resulting from persistence of omphalomycetic duct, also known as vitelline duct. It is a true diverticulum containing all the layers of the bowel part. So it is a remnant of the small intestine, that is omphalomycetic duct or vitellointestinal duct. So coming to the omphalomycetic duct, anatomy is proper. Vitelline duct or omphalomycetic duct. So to understand this, you must be able to know some basic points regarding the embryology. So the vitelline duct or omphalomycetic duct anomalies are secondary to the persistence of embryonic vitelline duct. Each normally obliterated by 5th to 9th week of intrauterine line. So these ducts usually get obliterated by 5 to 9 weeks of intrauterine line. Meckel's diverticulum is the most common vitelline anomaly. So coming to the embryological point of this, so during 3rd week of gestation, the pituitary is moved into the yolk sac, which does not grow as rapidly as the rest of the embryo. Subsequently, by week 5, the connection with the yolk sac becomes narrowed out, and this is then around the yolk sac, or vitelline duct, or omphalomycetic duct. Normally, the vitelline duct disappears by gestational week 9, just before the midgut returns to the abdomen. So this diagram showing the duct. So you can see the yolk sac, that is the developing embryo. So here there is a communication with that. So that is the developing embryo, that is the yolk sac. So the connection becomes narrowed out, that is the line duct. Here it is still more narrow. In the developing embryo here, you can see the development of the GIT there, and midgut is communicated to the outside yolk sac, that is the vitelline duct. You can see it here. So these are the diagrammatic representation of vitelline duct anomalies. You can see here that is the midgut area. and this is the abdominal wall, the region of the umbilicus. So there is a persistent, a part of it that persistent vital intestine that forms Meckel's diverticulum, and sometimes that is attached, or a piece of this is attached to the umbilicus by means of a fibrous cord. Here you can see, so this is the ileum midgut, this is the surface, that is abdominal wall. So whole of the vital intestine duct get obliterated except in the middle, which is distended now to form a cystic sphincter. This is complete process of the vital intestine duct. There you can see the ileum that is midgut here, communicated to the anterior abdominal wall through patent vital intestine duct, forming a fistulous tract between the intestine and the outside, that is infracutaneous fistula. So we will now understand the origin of this Meckel's diverticulum. So now go to the description of Meckel's diverticulum. So whenever you are talking about Meckel's diverticulum, we will say that rule of two. That is very important to remember so many things. So the Meckel's diverticulum tends to occur in 2% of population. It is 2 inches long and it lies 2 feet away from the ileocecal valve. And more commonly becomes symptomatic in children younger than 2 years of age. And two types of tissue, that is ectopic tissue, which are normally encountered in the Meckel's diverticulum, are one is stomach and second is pancreas. So that is about the rule of two. You should remember it. One is Meckel's diverticulum. Incidence is 2%, 2 inches long, 2 feet away from the ileocecal valve, and more symptomatic in children less than 2 years age. And two types of ectopic tissue is present, that is gastric and then pancreas. It's one of the most unlikely to be the cause of symptoms. Only about 4% of the children with the Meckel's diverticulum develop symptoms. Remember that. Only 4% of the children which contains Meckel's diverticulum develop symptoms. That too, 60% of them who develop the symptoms will be younger. That is younger than 2 years of age. And finally, the male to female ratio is about 3:1. So 3 males are affected to 1 female. That is the ratio. Coming to pathophysiology, the most complications of these abnormalities are related to the ectopic tissue. Most often, the normally situated Meckel's diverticulum does not cause much problems except because of the ectopic tissue they contain. So they can cause some problem like gastric, pancreatic, colonic, endometriotic, and hepatobiliary tissues. So these tissues will cause secondary effects. The first one is ulceration of adjacent ileal mucosa. The ileal mucosa is not equipped to buffer the acid produced by the ectopic gastric mucosa, and as is prone to ulceration. So first change that can occur is the bleeding, and second one is ulceration. So gastric mucosa, that is ectopic gastric tissue that is present in the Meckel's diverticulum, secretes more acid, but ileal mucosa, that is surrounding ileal mucosa, is not equipped to buffer the acid that is coming from the stomach tissue. So naturally that is get ulcerated. So second change is the ulceration. And third one is intestinal obstruction. So the causes for the intestinal obstruction is it may be caused by Meckel's diverticulum attached to the umbilicus by a fibrous cord, that is one, or a fibrous cord between the ileum and the umbilicus proper. So these are the reasons for the intestinal obstruction. Sometimes intussusception may occur with the diverticulum. That is more common than these fibrous bands in intussusception. So by list, we can see the complications of Meckel's diverticulum. That is ulceration, hemorrhage, small bowel obstruction, most commonly because of intussusception, sometimes because of the band, catheter band, and sometimes the diverticulum may get infected to form diverticulitis, and finally sometimes producing peritonitis. So these are the complications of Meckel's diverticulum. Coming to the clinical presentation, usually the presentation is an older infant or young child. So in between you will be able to see. Most often presentation will be the painless rectal bleeding. Melena may be episodic and usually ceases without treatment. And sometimes melena is insidious in onset and not appreciated by the family. And of course, third presentation will be the intestinal obstruction, usually due to the intussusception, and is the most typical presentation newborn infants. The symptoms include crampy abdominal pain, bilious vomiting, red currant jelly stools, and abdominal distension. We will discuss in detail about the intussusception in the chapter of intestinal obstruction. And sometimes the patient may present to you with intestinal ischemia along with cirrhosis, peritonitis, or shock, and may be fatal in some infants. And coming to the patients with Beckel's diverticulitis proper, so it often they show the symptoms or signs of that of the appendicitis. They are usually older children. Periumbilical pain is the first symptom, and they usually do not have the same amount or intensity of vomiting and nausea. That is the only difference clinically. That is, they have less vomiting and less nausea when compared to an attack of acute appendicitis. Coming to the diagnosis of symptomatic vitellointestinal duct malformation is mainly dependent on anatomical configuration and its presentation, signs and symptoms. History and physical examination, that's how they are important for the diagnosis of the condition. A complete description of the quality and frequency of the bloody stools is necessary in patients with rectal bleeding, and rectal examination and lower endoscopy may be useful in diagnosing and also to identify other causes for the rectal bleeding. And this is one of the tests, Meckel scan, for the test of choice for the bleeding Meckel's diverticulum, which concentrates, that is radioactive isotope is given, which is concentrated in ectopic gastric mucosa that can be visualized after fluoroscopy. So that is Meckel's scan. And of course, if the patient presents with intestinal obstruction, with intussusception or valvulus, whatever it may be, dilated bowel and multiple air and fluid level. So these findings indicate that there is a intestinal obstruction, maybe because of something else. The reason we don't know, but that give you an idea regarding the intestinal obstruction, and probably plain X-ray itself may give some suggestion that it may be because of the intussusception or valvulus. Coming to the management of these patients, symptomatic children with omphalomycetic duct remnants should be resuscitated before intervention. So because they are in the shock and maybe anemic because of blood loss, so they should be resuscitated before surgical intervention. Those with a significant hemorrhage should be transfused first. And if you go for the details of the surgery, the incision chosen varies with the symptoms and age of the patient. Children with Meckel's diverticulitis, simple diverticulitis, or a bleeding Meckel's diverticulum are operated on by using a transverse appendicectomy incision with the medial extension if necessary. And patients with suspected intestinal obstruction should be explored through a generous laparotomy midline incision. It is natural. If you feel that the pathology is localized and only Meckel's diverticulitis, then you can go ahead with a minimal incision like transverse appendicectomy incisions, which can be extended if necessary. Or if you feel that patient is already in intestinal obstruction or peritonitis, so better to go through the generous laparotomy incision. And removal of the Meckel's diverticulum is necessary. So that depends upon, once again, the structure where you are seeing. So it is always better to go for a wide excision rather than simple Meckelian diverticulectomy. The reason being, so the ectopic epithelia, that is tissue that is present there, will be surrounding the Meckel's. So in order to remove that, because the effects are mainly because of the ectopic tissue. So it is better to go for the excision of the whole segment of the small intestine, artery and osmosis of the intestine. So that finishes the Meckel's diverticulum, interesting condition. Then we'll go on to the other important condition, that is short bowel syndrome. This short bowel syndrome, by definition, it is the malabsorptive condition that arises secondary to removal of significant segments of small intestine. We have seen in the cross disease itself, so repeated surgeries are necessary with repeated removals of small segments of the small intestine. So finally resulting in loss of significant length of the small intestine. So the effects are very, very important. That is called short bowel syndrome. Intractable diarrhea with impaired absorption of nutrients following resection or bypass of the small intestine, ultimately leading to progressive malnutrition. So that is the definition of short bowel syndrome. So what are the causes for this short bowel syndrome? This is
Roll number 101, please turn off your mic.
resection of the small bowel.
Roll number 101, please turn off your mic. Rajshekhar Reddy, please turn off your mic.
So resection of small bowel is usually
Turn off your mic.
resection of the small bowel is usually done in cases of Crohn's disease, mesenteric vascular thrombosis, and radiation introduced tumors. So these are the 4 conditions where we do repeatedly small bowel resections: Crohn's disease, mesenteric vascular thrombosis, radiation introduced tumors. Symptoms usually appear when there is less than 200 centimeters. Removal of 100 or 200
Rajshekhar Reddy, please turn off your mic. Roll number 101.
Symptoms usually appear when there is less than 200 centimeters of the small bowel. So small segment removal may not cause much problem, but when you are attempting to remove large lengths, you must be very careful. So you should see at least 200 to 300 centimeters of the small bowel is left over. Coming to the effects of this removal of the particular part of the intestine, so changes in terminal ileal reception. So it usually results in malabsorption of the bile salts because intrahepatic circulation occurs in the terminal ileum, and also vitamin B12 deficiency because vitamin B12 is mainly concerned with the intrinsic factor that is related to the terminal ileum. So when you are removing the terminal ileal part, so it is going to result in malabsorption of the bile salts and vitamin B12. So naturally vitamin B12 malabsorption results in megaloblastic anemia. And bile salts absorption, malabsorption results in watery diarrhea, steatorrhea, gallstone formation, oxalate stone formation. These are the results of the terminal ileal resection. Resection of ileocecal valve usually results in bacterial overgrowth from colon, leads to diarrhea and malabsorption, and it decreases the intestinal transit time. And resection for the other segments like duodenal resection is going to produce malabsorption of folic acid or folic, iron and calcium. Large resections of intestines in general results in gastric hypersecretion. Massive resections are going to produce nutrient, water and electrolyte malabsorptions very clearly. Coming to the management of this short bowel syndrome. So medical management is main problem with these patients is the diarrhea. So you can use anti-diarrheal agents like loperamide, codeine phosphate, and cholestyramine, particularly in terminal areas bile salts deficiency. Cholestyramine you can give. Enteral and parental vitamin supplementation are necessary for these patients. And nowadays, mainstay of the treatment is home parental treatment. So because with this, the thing started in late 1960s, but useful in very much nowadays. So patients can enjoy near normal life with home parental treatment, though it is possible. But troubles are there still with home parental treatment, like catheter-related problems may be there, and sometimes the liver necrosis may occur following this. But in addition to that, the lifespan is very good and mainly depends upon the basic disease of the patient rather than the malabsorption of these nutrients. Coming to the surgical management, so they are mainly aimed to improve the surface area and reduce the speed of the transmit of remaining small intestine. So that is to improve the absorptive capacity. And nowadays, a small bowel transplantation is in use that may increase the survival rate. Now, we'll go to the last topic in small intestine, that is mesenteric ischemia. that is reduction in blood flow to the mesenteric vasculature. The mesenteric ischemia or vascular disease, superior mesenteric artery is commonly involved in the inferior mesenteric artery. Even if the inferior mesenteric artery is involved, most often it is not symptomatic because of the very good collateral circulation. So superior mesenteric artery, when it is involved, it is going to produce loss of the intestine for a greater extent, starting from the duodenal jejunal junction, even up to the level of the splenic flexure. But most often, one of the branches of the superior mesenteric artery is involved rather than the main trunk. So these are the types of mesenteric vascular diseases. So the ischemia may be with occlusion or without occlusion. That is one category. Second is it may be venous or arterial. Third one is it may be central or peripheral. These are the three types of the mesenteric ischemic diseases. Regarding the causes of the ischemia, so obstructive causes, embolism tends to occur in 50% of the patients, usually from the left atrium in a patient with atrial fibrillation. That is one cause and most common cause. A mural infarction, particularly in myocardial infarction, left ventricle may give you some embolism in the peripheral arteries. Third one is atheromatous from the aorta and aneurysm. And finally, in case of endocarditis, vegetations on the valves, particularly mitral valve and aortic valves, they get dislodged and form emboli in the mesenteric vasculature. So these are the four causes, and less common is left atrial myxoma. These are the causes for embolic obstruction of the mesenteric vasculature. Coming to the thrombosis, it may block the organ of superior mesenteric artery and causes ischemia, and usually due to the atherosclerosis, commonly occurs in superior mesenteric artery and sometimes iliac artery also. Regarding the non-occlusive causes, so they tend to occur in hypertension and hypoperfusion due to vasospasm and shock. For example, in case when the patient is in shock for any reason, so the hypertension will be there, so hypoperfusion of the tissues will be there. As a compensatory mechanism, there is a increased blood flow to the essential organs like brain and heart. So reducing the blood flow, that is redistribution of blood flow occurs, reducing the blood flow towards the mesenteric circulation, which is less important. So there may be hypertension and hypoperfusion resulting in ischemic, visceral ischemia, that is mesenteric ischemia. So this is a separate entity, that is a superior mesenteric vein thrombosis. So it tends to occur in patients with portal hypertension, portal pyemia, sickle cell disease, and patients on oral contraceptive pills. These are the four conditions in which you can see sometimes superior mesenteric vein thrombosis. Coming to the pathology, so the mucosa being the most actively proliferating tissue in the intestine. So that is the tissue that is first affected with the ischemia, which is solves and gives rise to ulcerations of the bowel. And as time passes on, bowel and mesentery becomes edematous, friable, discolored, and collected with the fluid and plaque. Once gangrene sets in, perforation may result, which can lead to peritonitis. Coming to the clinical features of the mesenteric ischemia, the most important clue to early diagnosis is sudden onset of severe abdominal pain, severe. So in patients with atrial fibrillation or atherosclerosis, any pre-existing disease like fibrillation or atherosclerosis, patient complains you of sudden onset of severe abdominal pain, suspect mesenteric ischemia. Pain is typically in the center of the abdomen and of the fall proportion to the physical findings. Patient may not have much guarding rigidity like that, but patient will be definitely have severity of the pain will be more. Persistent vomiting and defecation occurs early with subsequent passage of the blood. So later, as the time passes on, patient may show tenderness, rigidity, and other features of the shock may set in. So coming to the investigations, so if you go around the blood investigations, patient will show a profound neutrophilic leukocytosis, and on plain X-ray abdomen or the CT scans, you will be able to see there is an absence of the gas in the lumen of the small intestine, very, very important artery sign. And later, as time passes on, gas will be present within the intestinal wall and occasionally in the mesenteric and portal lobes. These are the important findings. Plain abdomen CT scan are more important in these patients, which shows the absence of the gas within the lumen early. In late cases, the gas may be present within the intestinal wall and occasionally in the mesenteric and portal veins. Treatment includes resuscitation first, so as to patient must come out of the shock. In early cases, laparotomy with embolectomy may be useful, via the ileocolic artery or revascularization of superior mesenteric artery may be attempted with a vascular surgeon by using a vascular bypass. Of course, anticoagulation should be continued post-operatively. If the patient comes late in cases where the already bowel has gone into gangrene, then resection is indicated. Of course, mortality is very, very high. Coming to this entity of chronic small intestinal ischemia, it results from atherosclerosis, which is a slow process. It affects the proximal superior mesenteric and celiac vessels. Patients present with severe central abdominal pain that comes on within 30 to 60 minutes of it, that is mesenteric angina postprandial. So there is an important clinical finding of the history the patient gives. Patient regularly will get pain after taking food 30 to 60 minutes. So there may be weight loss with diarrhea. So the differential diagnosis for this chronic mesenteric ischemia includes the peptic ulcer disease or irritable bowel syndrome. Management, so usually by visceral angiography, so first it has to be done with the stenting or angioplasty may be attempted. Or bypass surgery may be necessary in some cases, and it is mandatory that patient should stop smoking if he is a smoker, because that is going to produce a lot of change in the management. And finally, anticoagulation therapy. So this finishes your small bowel. So next class we will start with the large intestine. Any doubts? Any doubts? Please respond.
Madam, in Meckel's diverticulum, small bowel obstruction, fibrous bands అని అన్నారు కదా, అది ఎలా చెప్తారా?
The fibrous band, I told you that I have shown you that. I'll tell you. Usually band will be present. That is one of the anomalies. So persistent of the vitalointestinal duct as a band may be there. Oh, this is the. Are you able to see now?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So this is complete persistence of the vitalointestinal duct resulting in the fistulation between the intestine and the surface. That is enterocutaneous fistula. And this is other form. So where this part and this part get obliterated, only central part remaining, that is going to result in cyst. Whereas this is the Meckel's diverticulum. Sometimes this band may persist. Okay. So in this case, it can rotate on itself, that is valvulus like, or this can press upon one of the intestinal loops to produce the intestinal obstruction. So as in the Meckel's diverticulum may not cause intestinal obstruction directly, but most often because of the presence of the band, it is going to produce intestinal obstruction. That is one cause. But because of the presence of the Meckel's diverticulum, that forms the starting point of intestinal intersusception that can produce intestinal obstruction. So these are the two reasons why intestinal obstruction occurs in Meckel's diverticulum. One is because of the pressure by the fibrous band, or one loop of may undergo valvulus or make compressed by the fibrous band. That is one. Second is the Meckel's itself forms a starting point for the intersusception. We will discuss it in detail about these two things in the intestinal obstruction. Are you able to follow now?
Yes, ma'am. Okay, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Okay. Anybody else? What's the time? Record at this one.